Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. My guest probably needs no introduction for most of the viewing audience, but for our podcast listeners and anyone else, my guest today is Dan Kaufman. Dan, can you introduce yourself?
I am Daniel Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University. I also host the show Sophia that's on meaningoflife.tv. And I've done a few dialogues with Aryeh now about popular culture, Star Wars one, and also some on comics. And I'm very happy to be on again. I have to say, I've been kind of hoping you'd ask me on again, Aryeh, because I'm watching you do all these pop culture dialogues, and I'm feeling a little jealous. And so, thank you.
So our game plan today is we have two topic areas. One is pop culture, and that is returning to Star Wars. I'm wearing my Everything is a Remix, or Remix
sweet,
Everything
that's cool.
shirt, which was a Kickstarter reward for the Kirby Ferguson project. Everything's a Remix. He talks a lot about the Star Wars movies as being like creative remixes of other movies. And I think this shirt is actually appropriate because the movies we're going to talk about are like remixes of the original Star Wars movies.
Yeah.
But the first thing we're going to talk about came from a discussion in the comment threads to a recent Meaning of Life TV episode I did about the trend of being a homebody among millennials, and we'll link to that episode. In short, there's a growing economy around letting people stay inside and stay at home instead of going out to keep them fed and entertained and occupied in ways that they couldn't have been like 20 years ago. So streaming services like Netflix and Hulu, apps where you can order food and someone will bring it to you, where you don't have to actually talk to a human on the phone, and other things like skincare routines, which is more something that women would do. And all these are like growing industries catering to young people who seem to want to stay inside instead of going out to a bar or a restaurant or something, or see a movie in a theater. And then you commented that, I think what you said was like, you wish there had been as much attention paid to Generation X in the cultural analysis.
I don't actually remember exactly the context in which it came up. I'd have to go back and look, but the sort of idea that sort of Generation X disappeared between the baby boomers and the millennials in the sense of cultural impact, and also even in the sense of just sort of cultural dominance. It feels like we went through a very long period where popular culture was basically dominated by baby boomer ideas, tropes, concepts, values, etc. And it seems like we're sort of seamlessly shifting to millennial ones without there having been the sort of, it's like, well, wait a minute, we're in the middle. And I actually read somewhere that the baby boomers are going to be the Xers are going to be the generations one generation that doesn't get a president, which is also kind of interesting. Unless it depends on whether you count Barack Obama as a Gen Xer or not, which has to do with where the line is drawn, because he was born in 1961, and I guess I think that's sort of a borderline. My wife was born in 1961, and she has much more of a baby boomer mentality than I do. As a matter of fact, it's one of the main sources of tension in our marriage is that she cannot stand the things about me that are the most Gen X, and it's because she's very much a baby boomer in her mindset. So yeah, I don't remember the context in which it came up, but yeah, I was sort of lamenting the fact that my generation's kind of disappeared.
Yeah. So So what we want to discuss, compare the generations. Why did we have this skip from boomers to millennials? What with their Generation X? I guess Obama, I thought he was Gen X and the very extreme older end of Gen X. But maybe, these dates are invented by demographers and journalists. So,
Right.
You can't say anything is definitive, but it seems like his politics was in a lot of ways anti-boomer politics. And
could you say how so? In what sense?
He wanted to close the book on the like national division over the Vietnam War, and in some way a lot of the Cold War as well. He went to Cuba. He ran against a boomer icon in the person of Hillary Clinton, and then another kind of boomer icon in the person of John McCain, and defeated them both. And yeah, it seemed like we were turning the page from Obama. Obviously, that was wrong. We have a baby boomer president once again. Donald J. Trump is a baby boomer. And it seems like he's probably going to be the last boomer president. I don't know. When you're watching some of these hearings recently, the ability of these people to hang on and get reelected over and over again into their 80s is remarkable. But there's no one older than Trump who's kind of like in the arena, like ready to challenge him.
Well, I don't know. I mean, but in terms of the Democrats, I'm seeing talk about a lot of people I'm seeing talk about are old. With Joe Biden.
That's true. I think Biden is older. Biden is like
Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I think Biden is a year older. And
I don't see any evidence that the Democrats are. I mean, I hope that that's wrong, but that they're going to go to their younger bench this next time around. I mean, I really think they should if they want to actually win. I think they really should go to the younger bench, but I'm not seeing clearly that they're going to. I mean, do you think they're going to, Aryeh?
Well, I think
for the presidential nomination.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I don't think Biden's going to run. I think his career is basically over. I guess I wasn't thinking about Bernie. I think Bernie is 72 or 73, so he would be older than Trump. And yeah, he could. It's conceivable that he could win the nomination. I don't think it's super likely. I kind of don't think he's going to run again. I feel like he's at the end of his career as well. And then like you have this crop of other people like Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Kristen Gillibrand, Amy Klobuchar, who are like in their 40s more or less. I think most of those people are in their 40s, and so those are Gen X, Gen X politicians.
Yeah, I don't know how old Cory Booker is. Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see. Don't count the baby boomers out yet, though. I mean, they're going to find a magic pill that'll allow them to, run for president when they're 100. It's funny, though, about Barack Obama. I mean, just what you were saying is that, all the things you said is absolutely right in terms of the sense in which he's tried to break with the baby boomers. And actually, it was one of the things I really liked about him was that I was hoping that we were going to get beyond the very well-entrenched partisan divide that came out of that generation, the sort of the Nixon versus McGovern kind of dialectic. But in another sense, Barack Obama struck me as very much baby boomerish and not Gen X-y at all. And that is in his optimism, his utopianism, we might call it, or his idealism at least. He certainly was one for great social causes. And to me, one of the most defining elements of Gen X is a certain kind of world-wise skepticism bordering on cynicism about institutions, no matter who's in charge of them. And I in that sense, Obama struck me as more of a throwback to the previous generation, which of course was defined by its idealism. And that's also what, in my mind, connects the boomers to the millennials is that sort of, again, that sort of idealism, that sort of the pursuit of causes, especially, sort of social justice, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I would characterize Obama. I guess I think I would split him down the middle a little bit,
Yeah, I think he's
hope and change is not very Gen X. Right.
That's true. So, I mean, he definitely had an idealistic side. Sorry if you can hear my dog barking. He had an idealistic side, but he also had a very like cynical, we know that all these politicians are pieces of shit side, except for himself, of course. But kind of seeing, not wanting to participate in the Washington rituals that people at the time were urging him to, like going golfing with Mitch McConnell and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So he didn't do that kind of bullshitty stuff. And then the other side, of course, is that he is a black man or a biracial man or both. And I think a lot of these, the way we split these generations up, go according to thinking mainly about white people and not people who aren't white, and
not even just white. I would say it's largely suburban, right? I mean, certainly at least the way we've sort of divided the last few generations from the baby boom on, it seems to me in terms of the cultural determinants that we sort of mark these things, they're very much Americans, white, suburban. Sort of things, and I agree with you that if you look through different lenses, you might carve these things up a little bit differently. I mean, that's partly makes a sort of sense, right? Because the whole point of the generational accounts is supposed to be that, well, look, there's a kind of a shared culture from people who are born and within a certain period of time. There's going to be a whole set of sort of cultural icons and tropes and other things that they share that are familiar to them. But to the extent to which, even within a single generation, different groups of people live in different countries, so to speak, right? If you ask me what are some of the most iconic representations of Gen X youth, I'd say the John Hughes movies. But of course, that wouldn't be true if you said, no, by Gen X youth, I mean black people living in the Bronx in 1980, right? There's nothing like the John Hughes movies, and so I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right about that. It's sort of unavoidable though in a country of this size and complexity, right? I mean,
and then Obama, was born in Hawaii, was raised partially in Indonesia, so he had a much different childhood experience than anyone, any like suburban white kid on the mainland. Okay, so do you think there's a reason that Gen Xers have been, if we're saying Obama's an edge case, is there a reason there hasn't been a Gen X president, like a Reality Bites president?
It's not. I don't know if I want to sort of focus just on the president with regard to this, but I mean, if the broader question you're asking is there a reason why Gen X has sort of been culturally passed by, so to speak, that we're sort of moving straight from the boomers to the millennials? I would say my answer is that the boomers and the millennials both don't like our attitude and see us as a rebuke to them, right? That's why the boomers hate us. And I think the boomers had a tremendous effect on the acculturation of the millennials. And I think it's the reason why basically we think both the boomers and the millennials are full of shit. And the boomers and the millennials think that we're a bunch of meanies, right? And in my view, I'm sure we'll get into this, but I really think that the country could use a good dose of us, meaning my generation right now, because I really do think that we're getting trapped in a kind of a set of ideologies and what I would call self-delusions that I don't think are going to be good for us. I mean, I think we need a correction. Idealism is all fine, but I don't know if I want 50 straight years of idealism, right? And so I think it would just be a good idea if the Gen X sort of cynicism got to flourish for a little while before we plunged into another idealistic period full of causes and the like. But yeah, I think that the reason basically is that the boomers and the millennials have decided that together they're going to box us out, right? Because they don't want to hear what we have to say, and what we have to say is a pox on both of you. So that's now, is this some sort of conspiracy that was hatched together in a room somewhere? No, of course not. But it sort of looks that way culturally, right?
Yeah, here's a thought that just occurred to me, and you can tell me what you think. Who is the most prominent cynical person in America today? I'd say it's Donald Trump.
In a certain way, yes.
So we said he's a boomer already. When did Donald Trump really come of age? I think it was New York in the 80s.
You think he is Generation X, right? Is
it possible to say he's more Gen X than baby boomer? Like, what are the baby boomer things that he evinces? Like, I guess he's self-centered, and we can consider that a baby boomer trait. And yeah, he might be the most self-centered human ever to walk the earth. But yeah, just like from my perspective, Donald Trump doesn't believe in anything besides himself. Like, anything he says, anything coming out of his mouth is cynical because he's just saying it to get a reaction. So I think we're in an age where no one, like, right now, like, no one trusts the media. Drain the swamp, but is the swamp ever really going to be drained?
But they do trust their own media, right? I mean, and here's the thing. I mean, look, if you were going to say who's the most cynical person in America, and I was going to answer Bret Easton Ellis, right? Which to my mind is sort of like, if you asked me sort of, what is a Gen X? If you wanted to distill down the attitude of Gen X, I would say, the dark side of it is Bret Easton Ellis, and the light side of it is John Hughes, even though John Hughes was a boomer. But his art is Gen X. But see, the thing about Ellis, unlike someone like Trump, is Ellis doesn't believe his own bullshit either, right? And it seems to me that when you're talking about this period now in which nobody trusts the media, nobody trusts the news, nobody trusts the institutions, they do trust their own. And I think that one of the things about the Gen Xers was that we really understood that our own were also bullshit, right? I mean, in the sense that, in that sense, I thought we were really kind of, in some ways, apolitical. And that's why I think that, and if you don't want to expand in this direction, please, you don't have to, but I'm just going to leave it here. I think that's why someone like Bret Easton Ellis, Joan Didion resonated with him so much. So the generation that birthed my generation were not the greatest generation, but was the silent generation. And if you read Joan Didion, especially, who to me is in many ways a paradigmatic voice of that generation, and she somewhat takes on that mantle herself. One of the things that she sort of is that she's most consistently sort of addressing is the self-deluding narratives that we constantly inhabit. And I think that if I was to distill down Gen X's attitude to one sort of valuable quality, it's the ability to not believe your own bullshit and to recognize that we all are very, very prone to descend into self-serving and self-deluding narratives, and that as a result, there should always be a certain level of sort of humility in terms of just how strongly we're willing to assert something, push a position, demand something of someone, all that sort of thing. And so, and it's an interesting question why the generations have these qualities, why the silent generation has this quality and Gen X does, and then why the boomers have this other quality. And I think part of it has to do with, what you experienced while growing up and whether you sort of witnessed as a child things falling apart or whether you were involved in the things falling apart as more of an adult and thus were in some position to do something about it, right? So the silent generation were children watching the world fall apart. The greatest generation were already adults. They had to deal with it. And similarly with Gen X, I was a kid watching the institutions lose all their credibility. Watergate, the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the inflation and stagflation of the 70s, the malaise culture, all that sort of stuff. And so I wasn't an adult or in a position to. I just sort of watched it, and I think if you were to ask me that's part of the reason why you get this pairing between silent and Gen X, and then boomers and millennials.
Yeah, that's interesting. So obviously the boomers grew up during a time of plenty, and and
were parented by people who had just won the most important victory that arguably our civilization has ever been faced with, right? I mean, the defeat of fascism.
Right.
And so they really were raised with this idea of, we can transform the world.
Yeah. And then my generation, so I was born in 1983. We were largely, like, millennials are largely raised in the late 80s through the 90s through 2000, 2001, which was also a great time of material plenty. The beginning of the internet boom and the Clinton presidency and the fall of the Berlin Wall was the first signal event of my life, and then I mean, this sounds crass, but you said watching things falling apart. Well, my generation, our childhood is we watched the World Trade Center fall apart. There was this, we had an idyllic political childhood. Really, when you look back on it, although there was all sorts of nonsense surrounding, Bill Clinton and his sex life.
Yeah, but not that would have filtered that way. I mean, Bill Clinton's presidency was tremendously successful. I think it's crazy to suggest otherwise. Politically.
There was no threat to, we didn't have like nuclear drills. There was no we didn't feel like there was a threat, and things had to kind of violent video games and gangster rap had to come up to be the threats to threaten our childhood.
You always know that there's nothing really wrong when people are obsessing about stuff like that, right?
Yeah, when they move on to culture, it's we're doing okay. But then 9/11 is the second signal political event of my life, and I was 18 when that happened. I just started college. And then, it's been a shit show ever since then. And, I guess the third single political event was the Great Recession. And then you could say the election of Obama was the fourth. So most of them have it. So some positives, some negatives.
But you were already older. So when the shit show started, I was 6 during Watergate. It would have been a lot different if I'd been 18 during Watergate, I think, in terms of my attitude, in terms of sort of the way it affected my consciousness. And I would say the same thing about you. I mean, my daughter was born in 2002. And so she grew up as a child in this world of terrorism and economic collapse and all this sort of stuff. I'm not sure if the logic I described is going to continue on inevitably, right? I mean, in other words, that logic may only be true for a circumscribed period of American history, and things may change in such a way that it's not true anymore. And so I don't know about what's going to happen. I mean, I was kind of expecting that my daughter's generation was going to be more like mine and less like yours, but it's not looking that way. And that's why I'm wondering whether this logic that I've described basically after the Cold War really is not gonna follow anymore, right? I mean, is not gonna continue. Let me just say one thing about 9/11 and about the economic the 1998 economic crash. I would suggest that neither of these are of the same level as the ones that we're talking about, as were experienced by the silent generation, and I'm sorry, from the greatest generation through Generation X. 9/11 was very spectacular, but more people a year drown in pools, right? I mean, it really was not. It does not signal any sort of existential. It's not like being 12 years old and having nuclear drills and going under your desk, right? And watching The Day After on television.
Well,
I mean, walking into school wondering, if you're going to get nuked next week by the Soviet Union, who have got 3,000 ICBMs pointed at you. I mean, I almost feel like 9/11, we almost felt like we had to manufacture another something as big as the Cold War in order to sort of be able to justify continuing to be on this kind of endless war footing. I never understood the reaction to 9/11. I always thought it was wildly overstated.
Yeah. So so 3,000 people died. So that was
nothing. I mean, in
so
terms, it's
the number of people who died because they're not wearing their seatbelt every year is more than that. At the same time, it made everyone go.
From Afghanistan are not going to overthrow the U.S.
Right, but it made everyone go insane.
I agree with that.
We were so insane that 80% of the public was invading Iraq is the right step to take right now. So a lot of people, they just went crazy. They vastly rated the risk of another catastrophic attack. And in 2001, 2002, 2003, I think a lot of people thought this would it's going to start happening regularly, that some sort of huge attack like this is going to be a regular part of life, and this is the new normal. So that didn't happen, and the terrorists on American soil were only able to pull off the one spectacular attack, and they haven't even got close since then. But it still affected people who were. So I'm one of the oldest people who can call himself a millennial. So a lot. many are younger than me, and they were in high school when this happened, or middle or elementary school, and yeah, it was like, they saw all the adults around them really freaking out about this shit, and
so did you. I mean, that's fair enough. That's yeah. No, I listen. I'm not, and we're talking about perceptions anyway, right? I mean, that's in terms of what shapes the consciousness of a generation. It's how they perceive things, not how they actually are, and so. I simply was pointing out that I'm really inclined to think that for whatever reason this menace was manufactured to a great degree, and in terms of the '98 crash, the difference I would say between that and something like the Great Depression, which the greatest generation would have experienced and the silent generation would have experienced as children, right? The difference is that the damage caused by the '98 is going to be much more long term, right? In other words, it wasn't as spectacular, right? You didn't wind up on the street. Your dad wasn't on the street selling pencils out of a cup, right?
Right.
What it means is that over the course of your life, you're going to simply not be as wealthy as your parents were, or maybe never ever have that career that you want. I'm not suggesting this isn't bad. I'm saying it's just not as spectacular. I don't see that as having the same kind of immediate effect on the consciousness of a generation as something like the Great Depression did, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Do you think that your generation and was impacted in the same way that let's say the silents were by the Great Depression?
No, because there wasn't a government social safety net then. People, the Dust Bowl happened, like people were starving, like
your sense of jeopardy is different, right? It's sort of,
yeah, like I never worried that I would end up homeless, after the 2008 financial crisis. Whereas, we know from history, plenty of people, I mean, there wasn't a the Okies were not traveling to California. The society was more settled. Like people obviously lost their houses, and that was the core of the crisis. But most people did not pull up roots and try to start life over. Right. I mean, it was probably easier. I mean, when you have less, it's easier to start life over than it is now when you have more, literally more material possessions, and also you feel more secure in society. So no, I don't think the Great Recession cannot compare to the Great Depression. Certainly, the political response to the Great Depression is not the same as the political response has been to the Great Recession. Just going back a little bit, you mentioned where did the Boomers and the Millennials seem to have a similarity, and Gen X and the Silent Generation seemed to have a similarity. Is but they didn't. There was no secret room where people were conspiring to do this. But I mean, in a way, there was a room, and it was our childhood bedrooms and our dining room tables, because most millennials' parents are baby boomers, and this isn't mentioned all that much. Weirdly, when it seems so obvious. My parents, my father was born in 1945, so right at the start, and my mother was born in 1950.
Sure.
So they were classic baby boomers in a lot of ways, and they they had me a little bit later in life than average for that time. My mom was 33 when I was born, and yeah, so most of us were raised by baby boomers and imbibed the values of them. And when people talk about millennials being raised by helicopter parents, we're still talking about baby boomers here mostly. That's who was monitoring our lives very closely, and they had very very different childhoods. So there's that there's a genetic link and a familial link.
Yeah.
In addition to this cycles of history kind of link. And it seems one of the critiques of my generation is we're too attached to our parents, or attached to our parents in unhealthy ways. My cat is going to make a cameo in a second. And yeah, I mean, that's the way we were raised, and our parents still want to be involved in our lives in a way that other generations, maybe their parents
Right.
wouldn't have like lived that long to begin with, and if they, it would have been somewhat more difficult to stay in touch now that without email and cell phones, and but then there's also just like the idea that we have been it's become a lot harder to gain the things that mark one as an adult in traditional American society today than it was 30 years ago. Those things being marriage, a job, and owning a home and having kids. So there's been there's been a delay in all those things. My wife and I actually own a home, but we live in a very affordable part of the country in Western New York. Most people...
Is it Rochester?
Yeah, Rochester, New York.
Yeah.
Most people I know my age don't own a home.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I look at my former students now who are your age, and because I've been teaching since 1999 at Missouri, and so I have students now that are well in their 30s, and almost all of them do not have careers in the traditional old-fashioned sense. They don't own homes. And if they have families, they're broken. They're broken in the sense that, I don't mean broken normatively, I mean descriptively. Mm-hmm. They're not married. The children are through people that they either dated or lived with for a while. And so you're absolutely right. I really don't, when I make jokes about millennials, they're just jokes. I mean, I really don't go for bashing people due to the things that are a result of their circumstances. I mean, this is all the result of what we've done, the older people. And no, I'm serious. Because it's easy to sort of, make fun of millennials and all that. But, when you did that, I thought the thing about the homebodies was absolutely remarkable. And all I could think of is why would a bunch of young, attractive people want to act like old women, right? Because when I think of somebody who never leaves their house, everything, I think of someone who's 90, like my mother is 90 years old and doesn't want to, I couldn't imagine why a 20-year-old would want to act like that, or a 25-year-old would want to act like that. But then when you start thinking, right, it makes kind of sense, right? Why they'd want to act like that. If you now start subtracting all the things that I had when I was 25 that now you don't. It starts to look a lot more reasonable. Let me just say one other thing, because you probably want to eventually move on pretty shortly. About Gen X that I think is useful and kind of unique, and that is, I do really think that if of the three generations, Gen X is the most apolitical. And that's for two reasons. I mean, one reason has to do with that sort of Didion-esque general suspicion of narratives, and especially self pleasing narratives. And how your political narrative is always a very self-pleasing narrative, right? Mm-hmm. But there's another reason that's very specific and situational. We are the generation that grew up at the time that we were able to see both the right and the left revealed for what they really were, right? So we watched Nixon, not a crook, right? Mm-hmm. And then we watched the baby boomers, the hippies, turn into the yuppies. Mm-hmm. And so that, to me, if you ask me, sort of what is your most core sort of political, sort of where does it all come from? It's like watching the hippies sell out and watching the Republicans turn into a bunch of right-wing, horrible troglodytes, right? Post-Eisenhower kind of troglodytes, right? That's, if you ask me. And so my politics is very minimalistic in a sense, right? Precisely because I don't trust anybody in politics. And so I just want a sort of a bare bones classical liberalism, and that's it. The rest of it, I don't trust the left to do it, and I don't trust the right to do it. And I think that that's very, very much a characteristic of the Gen X attitude. And I think we could use a little bit of it now. I mean, the politics now is so partisan and so vicious that I really do think that we could use a little dose of apoliticality right now. I know that's not a word, but I don't know what you think of that. But
yeah, it's interesting. Once again reminds me of Trump, as almost everything does these days. The way
you think he's apolitical?
No, the way he campaigned was he's literally an outsider to the political system. That's true. And then he kind of like campaigned as someone who would break the like partisan orthodoxy because he's going to go like right on some issues, left on other issues. He's just going to like, I think he said a lot of times when he was running that like he would hire just like the best people to be in his cabinet, like no matter what they believed. Okay, well, when he was elected, it turns out that he doesn't actually give a shit about anything at all. And so he just does whatever like the Republicans tell him to do, more or less. There's some things that there's a couple things that he did that like Ted Cruz would not have done, like the North Korea stuff and maybe the free trade, canceling trade agreements and blah blah. But other than that, he's down the line conservative, and so like the outsider, the whole system is rotten, drain the swamp guy had enough appeal to win the Electoral College, but then because it's this bizarre human known as Donald J. Trump, nothing nothing along those lines has actually happened. I want to mention, we'll link to it below, this essay that just went up today from the New York Times Magazine. How Much Power Do Millennials, quote, actually have? Is by Willie
I thought
Staley.
that was quite good. You sent that to me today, and I did read it before we talked. I thought that was quite good. I heartily recommend it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and he has a funny... I think he's around my age, a year or two younger, and he has a funny split between the good millennials and the bad millennials. The good millennials were born 82 to 89, and the bad millennials were born 90 to 2000 or so. And so this is kind of joking because he's like, of course, like that means I'm a good millennial. But he puts it into like, do you have, I think part of it was like, do you have a memory of life before like the online world, came into popular existence?
Yeah.
And then there's another split between people who grew up watching Sesame Street and people who grew up watching Barney as a cultural difference. Yeah. Which actually, my brother was born in 1990, and he watched Barney as a kid, and so I was like, 9, 10, 11 when he was watching Barney. I just remember how like stultifying it was and how much
did you hate it as much as I did having to watch it?
I mean, probably. My daughter. It was awful. Whereas like I think probably if you or I watched Sesame Street today, it would be like mildly enjoyable to pay attention to it. So that's an interesting generational divide as well. There's actually one more I wanted to mention. There's one other thing, which is that that has to do with my brother again. I played ultimate frisbee in high school.
So did I.
So ultimate frisbee was invented at my high school, believe it or not, 50 years ago.
No way.
In 1968, so Columbia High School in Maplewood, New Jersey.
Whoa, that's cool.
So there's always been a team there, and so it was like less unusual to play ultimate at that particular school. So I played it my junior and senior year, and I have very strong memories of.
You should tell people what it is, because people. I mean, there's going to be people who don't know what that is.
Yeah, it's a sport. It's a sport that is a kind of combination of football and soccer with a little bit of basketball, and you throw a frisbee around instead of kicking a ball or throwing a ball.
We called it football with a frisbee, is what we call it.
Yeah, so it's a fun game that's always been kind of like a niche thing. Like it's like people play it around the world, but many people don't know what it is. Anyway, it wasn't a varsity sport. It was a club at my school, and it's a varsity sport at virtually no high school in America, just a couple. So we didn't have like a faculty advisor. We just ran the thing ourselves, and that was just like how it was. And I was one of the few people who had a driver's license and access to a car I could use. The old station wagon that my family had from the early 90s. And so when we went to tournaments, we had to get up at like 6 a.m. and assemble in the parking lot. And I always ended up having to drive to these tournaments because, there was just like no one else had a driver's license. So it became such a running joke that like my nickname became "You Have to Drive." So fast forward 7 years later, my brother, born in 1990, he went to the same public high school, and he played ultimate frisbee too. And somehow between the two of us, the culture of it had totally changed to the parents being very, very involved. And
oh God.
And so my mom didn't even remember when we were talking about this a couple years ago. My mom didn't even remember that like I was the one driving, and she was like, "Well, why didn't we do the driving like the parents?" And I was like, "Well, you guys just, you weren't involved, and like we didn't think they should be involved. It was just like our thing." Whereas it only took 7 years for like the parents to be like very involved, like coming to games and cheering on the sidelines and driving them to tournaments and stuff. And yeah, so there was, and it's a lot. It was actually, there was a couple kids where like the older brother played and then the younger brother played years later. So it was like the same parents. It wasn't like a new set of parents entirely. It was just there was some kind of cultural change to these like younger kids that like they needed more help. Like 9/11 happened in between. I don't know what, like the Iraq War. I don't know what else it was, or just something in the air that was like, okay, now the kids need more help, like doing this stuff.
Just before we get into Star Wars, I just wanted to, the thing you said before about Trump. I never bought his apolitical stuff. I always thought that was bullshit. I never bought a minute of it. I thought during the election, the campaign, that he was essentially running as a sort of Pat Buchanan style paleo-conservative. So anti-foreign intervention, pro-protectionist trade policies, and then social conservatism, anti-LGBT, anti-drug legalization. That's what I thought he was setting himself up to run as. I should have known better. But I never really bought the apolitical. Do you think anybody really bought that apolitical, or do you think most of the people like me thought he was running as some kind of a paleo? The Buchanan mold of combination of right-wing cultural policies with more left-wing like economic
populism. Yeah. I mean, I think like the vast majority of Americans, including the majority of American voters, like have very little understanding of politics and pay almost no attention to politics. And you can't blame them because they have other stuff to do, and they're
busy.
They're raising their kids and working and driving their kids to ultimate frisbee tournaments and stuff like that. So Trump was just like this guy who they knew because of reality TV, and he was like this billionaire who always did the right thing, and people just like, so probably there were like 3 or 4 policies they could have associated with Trump, like build the wall.
Right.
I don't know, lock her up. Like, what were his other like big policies that like the man on the street could identify with? I don't know. So he just ran on the image more than policies, because most people don't have developed political philosophies or anything, because why would they need to have one? So
yeah, no, fair enough. So Star Wars?
Yeah, let's talk about Star Wars. So this is like extremely not timely, because we're going to talk about movies that have come out over the past 18 months or so. But we did a conversation after The Force Awakens came out, which we can link to. And I remember us both enjoying that movie a lot, and talking about how fun it was and what a good time it was. And then 3 other Star Wars movies have come out since then. They are, I think, in chronological order: Rogue One, The Last Jedi,
Solo. Was it Solo?
I think Last Jedi came out first, and then Solo came out this year. Because Last Jedi was last Christmas. Hold on. Hey, Lima, come on. Seems to be.
You are beset by an unruly menagerie.
Yeah, they're all over the place. Okay, so I think there's a couple interesting things. So one is a lot of pretty much everyone was happy. Fans, regular people, reviewers were happy with Force Awakens. Like, it was a joyous occasion for everyone. And that was not the case for Last Jedi. I think the reviewers liked it, but a lot of fans, like the hardcore fans,
there was a fan backlash.
Didn't like it.
Yeah.
So the question is like, what's the difference here? And then you also have like the spin-off side of it. So Rogue One was the first spin-off, and that was a prequel, like a direct prequel to Star Wars. And I think that was an economics, that was like a blockbuster, and people were more or less happy with it. And then Solo came out this year, and that was like the first kind of like, okay, they're going to do like a spin-off for like every character, it seemed like. And people did not like, so I think most people agree that Solo was not that good. It didn't do that well. And they seem to have canceled their plans to keep on doing these type of movies. There was going to be a Boba Fett movie,
which I'm actually kind of sad about that. I think one of the things I hope that we'll talk about a little bit is this kind of immediate reaction to fan reaction and also fan knee-jerk reaction. I think that this is what killed the Star Trek franchise, was what the fan reaction to Enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, in other words, I think this is killing video game franchises now. There's this almost immediate, such a brutal, immediate fan backlash that you almost get the sense that unless, you sort of poll the fans and find out what they want and then make the game exactly that way, you're just gonna get all this torrents of hatred poured on you. And so, in other words, I wish the fans wouldn't do it, and I wish that the developers, creators would not listen to it so much. And I don't know why at this particular moment this is happening to this degree. I don't know if you have any theories about this, or if you even agree that this is happening.
Yeah, I think so. The 20 years ago, the only what criteria were like the critics, like good review, bad review, and the box office, or whatever the video game equivalent of box office is. So people weren't like writing letters to the studio saying like, well, I like the movie, but this part didn't make any sense to me, or maybe like only like cranks and weirdos were doing that. There was no ability for the average person to.
They might write a letter to a fan magazine, right? They, so if they were subscribed to, pre-internet, if they were subscribed to film magazines that ran an article about the movie, they might have written a letter to the editor that might have gotten in. But you're right, there wasn't this capacity to just vent in a way that was publicly readable by everybody, right?
And then there's the tendencies that get amplified on social media, which are extreme emotion is what gets you attention and retweets and likes and so forth. And people figure this out really quickly. And so like a lot of, this has been going on for a while with online criticism, is like, it's either this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life, or this fucking sucks. Like there's no middle ground, because there's no reward for being like, well, a couple good things here, also some bad sides, like a mixed bag overall. Like
which is what most things really are, right?
Yeah, most things more or less are in the middle. So yeah, extreme reaction gets you a retweet, and then tribalism gets, social media exacerbates tribalism, and people can be tribal about anything. So the people the hardcore Star Wars fans who love The Last Jedi can be tribal against the hardcore Star Wars fans who hated The Last Jedi, and they can fight each other all day long and have get emotional satisfaction for doing that and feeling like they're in a great battle over the soul of Star Wars or whatever. So a lot of people were not happy with The Last Jedi, and some of it got mixed up with the idea that like Disney bought the franchise and Disney wanted the franchise to be like more like politically correct or racially diverse, which maybe they did. I don't know. The original Star Wars movie, the first one, is like every actor in it is white more or less, and then there's a couple non-white characters introduced later on. Whereas like in The Force Awakens, the main character is a woman, and the supporting characters are black man and Hispanic man. And then there was this real ugliness related to the actress. I think her name is Kelly Marie Tran.
The young Asian woman who played. Yes. I forget the name of the character.
I think her name is Rose something. Rose.
But she has a sort of a side adventure with Flynn, right?
Finn.
On the gambling planet.
Yeah. So people were like attacking her, in racialized terms or something, and
really nasty
stuff. So people were really a number of internet cranks were really incensed about this. So why don't we talk about like just Last Jedi and what you thought of it overall? Because I didn't think it was very good.
Okay, so it's funny, when we talked about Force Awakens, one of the things that I said to you was that two things about it. I said, well, gosh, it really is just a remake of the first movie. It has exactly the same structure. And secondly, that Kylo Ren is a real hipster Darth Vader, right? I mean, he's all self-tortured and everything, and I didn't find him very scary for that reason. But I also said that, really the test of this is going to be as to whether or not they can now make this franchise belong to the next generation of young people. In other words, this franchise is no longer, it's not for people like me, right? Mm-hmm. For people like me, it's just a nostalgia trip. And that you can't do that forever. I mean, not if you want to have a sort of a living franchise, right? You can't do that, right? You have to sort of adapt. And so I said the real test is going to be whether they are managed to adapt. And the reason why I like the Force Awakens, Last Jedi had 80 more things that I should have disliked than Force Awakens. But I do think it very successfully handed the franchise over to the younger generation, and in that it reflected what are their concerns and are their values and are their priorities, and it seems to me that as a 50-year-old man, I should be generous about that and not clutching the thing, saying no, keep it the way I like it. That just seems to me to be a stupid and selfish way to sort of approach popular culture. Now, I know exactly why people didn't like it. And people didn't like it because it has a very heavy-handed social justice component. I think that's also the reason why people didn't like Solo, because of some of that aspect of it. Whereas Rogue One really didn't have any of it. One of the things I have to just say, I think Rogue One is one of the best installments, period. I actually think it's as good as the first round of the three. I think you could have put it back with those three, and it would have stood up. And what I really liked about Rogue One is that it managed to introduce that diversity without constantly shouting it at you. So it had a female lead, it had a racially diverse cast, but somehow you just didn't feel like they were, look, here's our black person. Oh, look, here's a woman. And by the way, all the white guys suck, right? And, it sort of, it did it in such a more natural way. And it did it in a way that didn't, I thought it was really masterfully done. Last Jedi, I think, is very heavy-handed in that regard. It's very sort of obvious. But on the other hand, I say to myself, so what, right? I mean, it's for kids now. And these are the concerns of young people now. And, they'll grow up. You know what I mean? It won't stay. It won't be. It won't be purple hair forever, right? They will. But you know what I mean? I'm using it as a stand.
I mean, once you get your a gauge earring put in your ear, that's forever.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah. But so I just I thought it worked. I thought, and I actually read an article about this that I'm gonna link to in the link section, that really said that the movie is a metaphor for the handing off from one generation to the next, and that you see it explicitly in the Luke Skywalker arc, right? Right, and in a sense, he's going to sacrifice himself after having really failed to cultivate the next generation properly, right? He's going to take the responsibility for that, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought, people were furious about Luke's arc, and I thought it was great. I mean, I thought to myself, I said, something? That's actually that's really realistic in a way that sort of keeping him as sort of the shucks boy hero from the 70s, except now he's old, would have been ridiculous, right? Now, I know Mark Hamill wasn't very happy about the arc, and I don't know what arc he would have preferred. But I thought that the Luke arc was quite realistic and quite moving, and definitely stamped the movie as a generational torch passing, right? And saying, okay, look, yes, the franchise was built around these iconic characters, but if this universe is going to continue on, we do have to eventually move on to the next generation, just like the damn baby boomers should go away. Right?
Yeah.
Let somebody else have a turn, for God's sake. Right?
Yeah. So
that's how I felt about it to a great extent.
Yeah.
What did you not like, Aryeh?
Well, and we should say, I'm gonna spoil if this movie came out a year ago, so you should know by now.
Of course.
Yeah. So I guess I didn't it didn't really feel like a Star Wars movie to me, and then maybe that's just the nostalgia, because Force Awakens was almost a beat for beat remake of the first Star Wars, A New Hope. And then people were like, well, are they going to do Empire next? And so they didn't do that. So I guess that's a good thing. They're trying something new. I think maybe nostalgia is built into this, the franchise at this point. They're still making these movies 40 years after they first came out, like, and everyone like watches them as when they're children. So except for like very young people who are going to it for the first time. So I don't know, the nostalgia part. I don't know if they should get rid of that. But yeah, there were parts where, well, I mean, like Luke is like cynical Luke now, and I was very surprised in like the first minutes of the movie when he takes the lightsaber and tosses behind him, like, this whole thing, like, get rid of it. So that was surprising. It was, yeah. So the Luke stuff was interesting, and you could see how it made sense for him to, sacrifice himself and evaporate into, wherever the Jedis go, into the world of the Force or whatever. I assume
into the ether.
Yeah, I assume he'll be making a cameo as a blue ghost in the next movie because that's what they do. I mean, Yoda came back in that one. It was like, so obviously Mark Hamill is still alive and Harrison Ford is still alive, and sadly Carrie Fisher is not alive anymore.
Yeah.
So it seems like they have to do something because they can't have her play a big role just with CGI, which they actually did in Rogue One with the guy who plays.
People hated on
Grand
that.
Moff
I actually
Tarkin.
thought it worked pretty damn well in Rogue One. I mean, it was not really very distracting.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like to me it looked like a very good kind of like almost claymation or something that was in there. Like you could tell it wasn't real, but it looked pretty good, and you could just let it go on. And then Carrie Fisher appeared as a young woman at the very end of Rogue One, which is like I found affecting and moving. Seeing her as in her youth, her youth.
I find that incredible. I actually did not know. I had not read anything about Rogue One, and then as it unfolded, and it turned out to be the backstory as to how the hell the rebellion got the plans for the Death Star. I have to tell you, it gave me goosebumps. Having seen the original movie in the theaters as a kid, it gave me absolute goosebumps to watch. And I think that's why I think the movie is almost kind of a perfect movie in the franchise. It really was able to satisfy old guys like me, and I think at the same time satisfy a lot of the new sensibilities of young people now. I think, though, to be fair to Last Jedi, I said, well, why didn't they do it as well as Rogue One? Rogue One, it was a lot easier to do it. It was essentially a caper film. Right. Last Jedi is a huge sprawling epic, and you couldn't have done it that way. Let me ask you about the nostalgia thing, because this is really interesting. Star Trek had no trouble with that, right? So, and you can't talk about anything more iconic than Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, right? And yet, Next Generation was even more successful and had none of those people in it. And do you think there's something about is there something about Star Wars that you think makes it unable to shed the nostalgia element and continue on in this way, or what?
Well,
or is it just you, or what do you think?
Well, it's interesting to compare the two, and like a lot of as kids, we would debate like which one was better. But like their history is very different. So like Star Trek was kind of a failure in its initial run. I think it was only 3 years. And then it went away for a number of years, and then started coming back with the movies. So it was
no. Well, the reason they got the movies was because it was very successful in syndication. Mm-hmm. So it went off the air after 3 years, but then all through the 70s growing up, it was everywhere.
Okay,
right?
that's interesting.
I watched it as a kid growing up because it was successful in syndication, and that's how they got the movies made. Yeah. So I'm sorry.
Okay, but whereas Star Wars was like an immediate blockbuster that like everyone, whereas Star Trek was more like people who are into sci-fi, which was fairly in its infancy in the late 60s, whereas Star Wars by that point, like sci-fi had been accepted as a movie genre, and it was the highest grossing film of all time, I think, when it first came out. So there's that difference of like who the average person has seen the Star Wars movies. Has the average person seen Star Trek I've only seen a couple of the movies. The Next Generation was on through my childhood, and it would air in syndication, and I've seen a lot of those episodes, but I've only seen a couple of the original episodes. Then so when it was time for, and only Leonard Nimoy I think appeared in the rebooted movie, playing like an alternate reality version of himself, and so those people were older. A number of them are no longer with us. So there's that part of it that it's not like we still feel like the strong like emotional link to Harrison Ford or Mark Hamill. just going back to Rogue One, which I actually just watched today.
Did you think it was as good as I did?
I liked the final sequence, which is kind of like the final 45 minutes. Like that was exciting and well done. The earlier parts I wasn't as crazy about. I mean, it's a strange movie in that, spoiler alert, all the heroes die at the very end.
I thought that made it kind of really. I like that about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, so it's like a tragic story, or these people are like sacrificing themselves for the greater good, and not even a single one of the characters we've been, growing accustomed to over the earlier 2 hours survives to tell the tale. So that's weird, and for a big blockbuster movie, it's certainly interesting to do that. I liked, getting back to nostalgia, there were a number of little like moments pointing towards the earlier movie, like a character would appear from the first Star Wars, it would appear on screen for 3 seconds or something. So there was that, and they kept on having the robot or the droid say things that were like made us think of C-3PO, and then he finally almost says, "I have a bad feeling about this," but then the other two characters are like, "Stop it!" So that was a funny twist on that being a classic phrase. So I liked it. I liked it better than The Last Jedi. So just to get back to Last Jedi,
I'm sorry. Yeah,
it was. I don't know. I felt like there were just big structural problems with how they wanted this, how they built the story. Like they had this like search for. It's like a MacGuffin kind of. It's like they need to find the guy who can break the code so that they can cut through the thing, so they can go to warp speed again and not be followed. So it's like a Rube Goldberg, and then they do it, and like I almost think like after seeing it for the first time, I was thinking that it was supposed to be Lando to playing the role of the codebreaker guy, who was played by Benicio del Toro, because they're like, that would just make more sense that it's like someone we know than just this random guy, because then the random guy betrays them, and we're supposed to be like, a betrayal but from this guy who's just a criminal. So that doesn't make any sense. They're all like shocked that this guy who they just met betrayed him. And then in the end, that whole sequence doesn't matter at all. It's just like meaningless to the plot, because of various things, and them coming onto the ship and shooting it out. So that whole it was like they needed to have a plot line for Finn. Yeah, they wanted to introduce a non-white female character. Like, what could we have them do? Go to this weird gambling planet and do some stuff there.
And then we could also like rip on rich people a little bit, and sort of like, and I agree with you. It's funny. I don't think it was a good movie, but I think it was successful in the sense that I thought that the main thing it was tasked with doing was what I described earlier, and that was breaking out of the nostalgia to the extent to which that the franchise would now has new people, and reflects new concerns, new values, new mores, etc., that are in line with the current young generation. I thought it did that very well, and I thought in some of the ways it did it in a very moving, powerful way, like Luke's arc. It also did it in more annoying ways. I mean, I actually find the main character in that movie really sort of I find her really implausible. It's just like, she wakes up one day and she's just the most powerful Jedi ever, and nobody, and she's never wrong about anything, and it's just really, in that sense, I thought that the female protagonist in Rogue One was so much better, because there wasn't all of that over. You could still respect her and be impressed without feeling like it was like, a feminist billboard, right? But and so, like I said, there are 18 more reasons why I should have hated Last Jedi than Force Awakens. But I really do think I think it's really important that young people have these kinds of access to these sorts of mythologies through entertainment, and for cultural reasons. And I don't like people my age or older trying to take it away from them by saying, no, this is ours, and you can't have it, and don't you dare change it, and don't you dare bring your values into it. I really don't like that. And so I'm probably more inclined to be more generous to it than you, because I'm trying to resist imposing myself on the younger generation's entertainments. You know what I mean?
I disagree with you about Rey, the main character. I thought.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think the performance is very good, and
I like the actress, but I don't like.
Well, so they set up so it's kind of like in the first one, it was an echo of Luke being this nobody from the middle of nowhere who, it turns out he has this this power. And
but he doesn't fight Darth Vader. Obi-Wan does, right? If Luke had gone up against Darth Vader in the first movie, he would have gotten his head cut off. Well,
okay, that's true.
Whereas Rey goes and beats Kylo Ren in the first movie, right? Which I just thought was ridiculous.
So the question is okay, so in the first movie, it sets up this idea that there's a mystery about who Rey's parents are, and it's is she actually Kylo Ren's sibling? Is she Kylo Ren's cousin because she's Luke's child, and how is she so powerful? And then there's this really I think the one really striking, memorable scene in the movie is when she's in this Hall of Mirrors kind of thing, and is looking.
You're talking about Last Jedi now.
Yes, sorry, in Last Jedi. And so she's in some kind of mystical cave or something, and she thinks. As I recall it, she sees kind of a form coming towards her, and she thinks that through the magical mirror or whatever, and she thinks that maybe it's going to be her parents coming towards her, and actually it's herself. And then there's this illusion of her infinitely moving in either direction, and so it's kind of my interpretation was she's self-created in a way, or doesn't matter where she comes from. Later on, Kylo Ren.
Later on, they're told that she's told explicitly, "Your parents are nobodies."
Right. So that's what Kylo Ren says. So who knows if that's true? He is a bad guy, so that bad guys lie. So yeah, he says your parents are trash and they sold you for money, basically. So then going back to the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, there's this strong idea that the Jedi is associated with bloodlines, and it's a hereditary thing. And the reason that Luke Skywalker is so powerful is because his father was so powerful, and the reason his father was so powerful had to do with these midi-chlorians that were in his bloodstream. That's never really.
Which I wish that they never.
That's never really explained. Yeah, so it's is there a genetic reason that someone's a Jedi? Is it because your parents are Jedi, or is it something that anyone can be a Jedi? It's kind of luck of the draw, and anyone could turn out to have a great talent for. Playing the violin or something. It doesn't matter what your parents did. And so there's a more kind of old style conservative sense of inheritance and aristocracy that's baked into the this old way of understanding the Jedi that's only the children of Jedi can be Jedi. Right. You over there on the tree, you'll never be a Jedi. And that Luke derives his power from his birthline. And then if there's this new understanding that anyone can be a Jedi, and it's shown in the very final scene that this street urchin seems to be a Jedi as well, that's a democratization of the
no
Force.
Problem with her being a Jedi from no inheritance, right? The problem I have is her being a Jedi that can beat the new Darth Vader with nothing. And even in the third one, I thought that the pacing was off. I'm sorry, the second one, the pacing was off. I thought Empire Strike Back was better paced in terms of us coming to believe that Luke actually would be strong enough by the end of his training to fight Darth Vader. The sequences with Yoda, I thought. I don't even know if they were actually longer than the sequences in the Last Jedi, but I got more of a sense that I could believe. I just didn't see Rey do anything that would make me believe that she could even last 2 minutes fighting against someone who supposedly is strong as Kylo Ren.
Yeah, I could see that. Luke says at one point the Jedi need to die. He's become disillusioned from the Jedi. He tried to teach the young children Jedi
and they turned into Kylo Ren.
Yeah, and he did such a bad job that one of them turned into a supervillain. So he's sick of that thing. So yeah, I think it was do we need this aristocratic sort of setup in which the Jedi are they're warrior monks, and they wear these robes and stuff. Is this necessary, or is it just anyone can can do it?
Yeah.
it's a contrasting view. One is more like small d democratic than the other, but also one is more kind of populist than the other. Instead of like, you can imagine the Donald Trump of the Star Wars universe being like, these elitist Jedi. They think they're so good with their lightsabers and their robes. They're like, what do they really know? I could be a better one if I wanted to. So there's that as well. But yeah, I didn't like it overall. I didn't like it the first time I saw it. I rewatched it for this conversation and was like, yeah, this still kind of sucks. It had some good parts. Visually,
I would not have predicted that I would like it better than you. That I would not have predicted. But I understand your reasons. And mine, to a certain extent, in a lot of ways, I didn't like it, but I really tried to watch it the second time, not through my eyes, but through, a 12-year-old kid's eyes.
Yeah.
And through those eyes, I think it was successful at what it was trying to do. Look, none of the Star Wars movies were great cinema. One of the things you really realize you go back and watch those original ones is how wooden the acting is, how stilted the writing is. It was always about mythology and myth making and never really was about. And so I think if the question is this good myth making for the current generation of 12, 13, 14-year-old kids? My answer is yes. I think it is. And I do think it managed to pass the torch and shed what was distinctive about it for us, for my generation. And in that sense, maybe it's the hardest for someone like you because you're kind of in the middle of it, right?
Right.
I guess your era really is the prequels. And those were such a disaster that you probably then went back to the originals to just not be sort of saddled with the prequels, right?
Well, really, since I'm an older millennial, the time when I saw the original movies on VHS as a kid. And then if you remember, they re-released them in theaters as a special editions in like 96, 97 around there.
You know what? I remember the special editions. I didn't remember them. They re-released them in theaters?
Yes.
Wide release?
Yes.
So you did see them in the theaters?
Yes. So I saw all those and was very excited by them. And then when the first prequel came out, which I think was 98 or 99, so I would have been like 14, 15 or so. I remember like being really excited to see it and then going to see it and being like, this sucks. Whereas like, I have a friend who is 28 or so right now, and he saw those prequels as kids, and he loves them still, even though he knows they're crappy. But like that was his entry point
into Star Wars.
Into this universe. So I don't know. Maybe every generation gives to the next generation the Star Wars that it thinks they want, and maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong.
But I think that's a good thing. I mean, like I said, I think every generation does need this kind of mythology, and I think this sort of entertainment is the way it's primarily transmitted now, not through books. I actually think it's very important. And so I'm just a little sad that because of some trolly fan backlashes, that it might be the case that they're just going to stop doing it, which I think would be a shame. I would like to see it go on, just as I'd like to see Star Trek go on. I'm actually really kind of disappointed at what they've done. I'm now watching the Orville as my Star Trek, right? Because Discovery, I think, is just sort of hopeless, and the reboot the films, I think, are done. And I don't think they're going to go back to them.
Yeah, they made 3. There's
this new Picard show coming out that I'm really wondering what on earth that's. So when that hits, you and I are going to have to talk again because I have no idea what that's going to be all about.
Yeah, but, and that was the Star Trek of my childhood, was Next Generation. So just I know we didn't want to talk about it a lot, but just briefly, I just want to mention Solo, which I saw in theaters. It was perfectly fine as like an adventure movie, but when you think like, oh, this is supposed to be the origin story for a one of the most beloved fictional characters of the past 50 years, it left something to be, there wasn't enough there.
Was it the actor or the writing, do you think, that failed to satisfy in terms of...
The casting was a huge miscasting. That guy that got to play the main guy didn't look, sound, move, act like Harrison Ford as Han Solo, so I don't know what they were thinking with that. I liked, just the nostalgia parts of like, oh, this is how Han met Chewie, like that was fun, and the other little parts. There were parts that were super cheesy when it's like they decided to name him Han Solo because he was flying solo on the passenger ship or something. That was a little too much. But yeah, it was.
What did you think about the thing with Londo? I mean, that's what created a lot of the backlash in this particular one from the trolley. The trolley. What did you think of how they dealt with that?
Well, I'm a Donald Glover fan. I've liked him since he was on Community. I thought he did a better job recreating the character than the Han Solo actor.
Oh,
did.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So it was okay. I mean, parts of it were. I mean, the movie had to. It was like they said, okay, we need to explain these 10 things about Han Solo, and from why his last name is Solo to how did he actually, how did he win the Millennium Falcon in a game of Sarbach or whatever it's called. So it was like, in some ways, it was like a dutiful going through, and they had to show that. I didn't actually catch what was the exact backlash to.
Was it about his sexuality or something?
Oh, there was a kind of implication that he might be gay or something, or bisexual.
Yeah, that's what I remember people bitching about the most.
I mean, that if this is like a guy who's like, a pleasure seeker in all realms of life, that was kind of the way he was portrayed in Empire, at least, and but also someone who's always looking out for himself, and that's why he turns them into Vader, or to Boba Fett at least. So,
although he does redeem himself later.
Right, yeah. So he has his own little heroic
in
arc.
Empire. I mean, he does redeem himself.
Right, and in Jedi, in
Jedi he redeemed himself for what he did.
Falcon when they blow up the Death Star. Yes, I was fine with that, but again, I don't know. If you stripped the Star Wars aspects from it, then it would have just been like a fine,
an average paper movie.
Yeah, action movie, and you would forget about it very quickly. But
Fast and Furious in space.
Yeah, or something like that. Yeah, so, but it is interesting that, it was so poorly received that they are at least putting on hold their plans to try to do, the thing that, Marvel has done to create, the cinematic universe and have a new film coming out every 6 months, which is a huge cash cow. And... yeah, but I don't know if I really need to know Boba Fett's backstory. Han Solo's wasn't that great. Are we going to find out why his name is Boba? Who cares?
Yeah, I don't know. I like the idea of filling in backstory. So that's one of the reasons I like Rogue One so much. And I think there's a ton of interesting backstory you could fill in without it having to be the history of iconic first gen characters, right? Mm-hmm. And I really hope that after Last Jedi that they are going to, if they keep going, that they're going to cultivate the new generation characters and not keep trying to throw back. I think that if they keep doing that, I do think it's going to die. I think it eventually has to leave those people behind and start and keep and have new people, just like Next Generation did with Star Trek. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're doing something that's going to be a TV show. That's a spin-off from the series that Jon Favreau is directing.
I've heard about that. Do you know anything about it?
The only thing I know is that they say it's none of the character. It's not going to be about any of the main characters, but it's set in the same universe. So that makes sense. And there's all those there's all these other properties related to Star Wars. There was this whole book series, and then there was cartoons and stuff that all play on the.
And some of those were very successful. I mean, the Clone War cartoon was not only successful, but I think critically well received.
Yeah, I've never actually seen that, but I've heard good things about it, and people said it was worth watching. Yeah, so there's a lot they could do with this property. That's not just R2-D2, the early years.
Right. C-3PO, where did he really come from, and why is he called 3PO?
Do you have anything else you want to say about Star Wars before we wrap it up?
No, I'm good. That's I said what I wanted to say, and I think people are probably a little, if they care, are a little surprised at my attitude about it. But I did not like it the first time, Last Jedi, and then the second time I watched it, I said, you know what? This is not being made for me. I need to look at it a different way. And then after I did, I did like it.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so Dan, I think people know that you host the Sophia Show on Blogging Heads, and you also edit the Electric Agora.
That's right.
And people can check that out. So thanks for coming on. And have they announced the next Star Wars movie? They must have said it's in
I
2020.
don't. You know what? I don't know. But when it comes out, we'll have to talk about it.
We can read that.
Something else I wouldn't mind talking with you about sometime. Now you mentioned Marvel Comics. Is the relatively poor fortunes of Marvel Comics and the incredibly great fortunes of Marvel comic movies, and the reason for that, which might get us into this issue of politics and social justice and current values versus old values and all that sort of thing. So maybe we could talk about that some other time.
Okay, yeah, that is interesting. I've thought about that too. How the these intellectual properties are like the blockbusters of our era, but I don't think, I was a comic book fan back in the day, and it's not like there's a comic book store on every corner now. Like, it's still like the original material is still a pretty niche thing for nerdy teenagers and and nerdy adults. So yeah, I think that is interesting, but we'll save that for another time.
All right, my friend.
So thank you, Dan. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Talk to you soon.